This is the second time, I think, that we've hosted a joint event between ourselves and the business school, the real estate program for business school at Untitled. I'm very happy to have our friends from just across campus here, so thanks very much for coming. So we wanted to talk tonight about the new buildings, particularly the new commercial buildings that are being built in New York, and what about them is significant in terms of keeping New York City and the region competitive. And, you know, starting really, I think, in the 1980s, with the development of Times Square, which then is an expert on the World Financial Center, and then going into the 90s with a lot of planning for the West Side, with the Senator Schumer's 235 report, and then on, obviously, past the tragedy of 9/11 and the World Trade Center site. There's been a tremendous focus in New York over the last several decades on where our office market is headed and whether we have enough supply. And we worked with the city planning department. This was always a major concern, whether there was a supply of office space that would keep us competitive, particularly with London and Tokyo. So, you know, there's a lot of focus put on quantity. I think where there was probably less focus placed was quality. Right, in the sense of what was it about these buildings, architecturally, technologically, in terms of sustainability, and in terms of the building space parameters, floor plates, and so forth, that set them apart and actually led them to be competitive, not just because we were producing space like widgets, right, but we're actually producing space that was valued by the marketplace in a different way. And, you know, to date in New York, there actually hasn't been that much discussion of quality of space. The brokerage community drives a huge amount of what happens in terms of the parameters of space, right? And so you have certain sort of rules of thumb standards, 45 feet from the floor, the edge of the glass, and so forth and so on. But there, you know, there really isn't that much that you hear from the community about, well, what's the air quality like? If you're getting into trading, what does that space need to be like? And also the distinction represented here tonight between multi-tenant buildings, which have their own very specific set of needs, and the needs of a building that is custom built and designed for an owner, in this case, a Hearst Corporation. And how do those things get differentiated? And finally, in terms of the end result, I mean, obviously, a school like this, we're in the School of Architecture here at Columbia, we're always thinking about that building on the first day. But how does the building perform over time? And what does it mean in terms of things like employee attrition, right? In terms of attracting new employers, because the level of the space, the quality of the space is so significant that people want to be there and international companies want to move in there. And so it's these issues that I'm hoping that our panelists will really touch on tonight as we have this discussion. The format of the discussion is fairly straightforward. After I do some brief introductions of the panelists, they'll speak for about 10 minutes each about the building, some of the specific choices that they made. And part of the idea of the panel struck us as I started touring a couple of these buildings in succession, sort of through July and August, and really noticing that these buildings were a step above anything that New York had produced prior to this. So I'm really hoping that our panelists will speak to those kinds of decisions, and you know, things like the break-even analysis. If you deploy a certain sustainable technology, does it really pay back over time? The kinds of questions that I think that we're really concerned with as people concerned with the development industry. So with that, I'm going to do some quick introductions and then ask Helena Durst to join the stage. So Helena Rose Durst is co-vice president and a fourth-generation family member of the Durst organization. Helena started her career as an intern at the Hudson River Park Trust, where she not only fell in love with the Hudson River waterfront, but also gained valuable insight into the city's complex land use review process. After studying real estate at Baruch College, Helena joined the leasing department of the Durst organization, where she has participated in and closed approximately 100,000 square feet in lease transactions. She also instituted a comprehensive greening of the company's building management operations that has improved landfill diversion rates, green cleaning practices, and resource conservation. Helena has participated in the construction and management of several projects from the ground up, including the Epic, the Helena, and One Bryant Park. Helena Elena is a board member of Citizens Union, Just Food, Governor's Island Alliance, High School for Environmental Sciences, and SWAP. So with that, I'm going to ask Elena to join the stage, and I will introduce our other panelists as they come up. And then let me see if I can figure out how to turn on the slides. Close this part. Look at that.
Hello, my name is Helena Durst. I'm a fourth-generation family member of the Durst organization. So,
there are 4 light bulbs up there, representing each generation.
Yeah. I got it. Sorry. Let me start over. My name is Helena Durst. I'm a fourth-generation family member of the Durst organization, and we like to think about green practices and sustainable building off of our history, and looking at what we've done in the past. I'm going to relay a few tidbits from my great-grandfather, Joseph Durst. Joseph Durst here on the right. He actually came from Eastern Europe as a tailor. He was actually making children's clothing out of used overcoats. So we've had a history of innovation. His sons developed into 3 modes of development, which was assemblage, a developer. Another brother, Roy Durst, Seymour Durst, was the assembler and the developer. Roy Durst was the manager, so knowing exactly what's happening within your buildings. And then the third component, of course, the construction, which is also sometimes the most exciting. So making sure that your buildings work inside and out, and also looking to that as to what you can be doing as far as innovation. Part of that innovation actually landed us into the developments that we have currently. Mostly we're focused in Midtown Manhattan, and that came from my grandfather saying that you had to be able to walk to all the properties that you own. That's crucial as part of the management. You need to be able to see exactly what's going on in your buildings. That is part of the most important part for management for us. We have our own cleaning crew as well as our own engineers. And we know that the people in the buildings are what makes the buildings different and puts us into a different category than other land owners, managers, and developers in New York City. So a little bit more about why we came here tonight and to talk about One Bryant Park and the new development. One Bryant Park was actually innovation that was based upon my grandfather's ideas of being able to develop specifically in Times Square. He started buying properties in the 1950s in Times Square, focusing on a specific area because he had a future development plan that would encompass 42nd to 47th Street, Broadway to 6th Avenue, and would have looked something very similar to what Rockefeller Center looks like today. Maintaining a lot of the historic theaters in the mid-block, as well as having a through-block passageway, as well as about 1 million square feet of convention space beneath. This plan was put forth circa 1969, which was 14 years before Jacob Javits Center actually ever came into being. Well, a lot of development is try, and try one more time until you get it right. So it took us 40 years to actually put this building up. But we're actually better off than going forward with what my grandfather's original plan was. We probably have as much square footage due to different zoning laws, and we have a much, much better stock of building. If we had built the building in 1960 on this site, it would have gone for maybe $50 to $90 per square foot maxed. We were able to top the market off in 2008 at $185 a square foot. And since you guys are business folks, I thought I'd relay that story. It's not only just about sustainable building for us. But what is green? What is green to us? It's about sustainable buildings. It's also about efficiency. So going back to my family's history, Roy Durst and his brothers, they put together the first glass facade on a building in New York City, using a glass curtain wall system, the first to be used in New York City. They also were talking about air conditioning to their father, and what they said to their father, "Dad, we really need to put air conditioning into the building. All the tenants are requiring it." Joseph's response was, "Well, why doesn't everybody just go home?" Well, we pushed that envelope, and we continue to push that envelope 4 Times Square, which is recognized as the first green commercial tower in the United States. And so it's about efficiency for us, and looking what we could do with One Bryant Park that would make it a little bit different, a little bit better than the rest of the buildings that we had, and hopefully what is in New York City, as well as the nation. To that extent, we did as much as we could with the Bank of America, thanks to the Bank of America, is putting into sustainable features. We have higher ceilings and translucent insulating glass, which means it gives us the ability to be able to get that square footage per square foot, as well as insulating our building. We have filtered under-air floor distribution. This allows us to keep the chilled water at a higher temperature. Chilled water is the water that you circulate through a building that needs to go past a fan. If you're able to keep that 10 degrees warmer, that means you're able to lower your electricity cost as well as lower your fuel usage. Carbon dioxide monitors. Carbon dioxide monitors are essential to making sure that the tenants feel better. A large part of the green building movement is what do the tenants do and how do they use the space. Gray water system. New York City is a combined sewer overflow system. That means every time it rains more than ½ an inch in New York City, raw sewage is going directly into our harbor. We're collecting 95% of the water that falls onto the building, reducing our septic system overloads. Same thing with the waterless urinals. Daylighting and dimming. This just means that we're making sure we're counting how much electrical usage we're using for our lighting system, as well as the oversized electrical conductors. Excuse me. We have green roofs on the system, which actually fight against our stormwater system, because if you have a green roof on your system, that means a green roof on your building, that means you're producing nitrogen, which goes against your gray water system. We also have a cogeneration plant, which produces about 5 megawatts of energy on site. Cogeneration means that it's not only generating power, but it's also generating steam. We use that steam for heat, as well as to run a chiller plant dedicated to the building. In conjunction with our cogeneration system, we also have an ice chiller plant, which includes about 40 tanks where we're creating ice at night. We're using the overload of the electricity during the night, to be able to produce ice. It's essentially a battery. Ice is used as a battery. We then melt the ice during the day, avoiding peak hour usage. Peak hour usage is when Con Ed is most likely to turn on peaker plants, as well as be able to charge you a higher price for that energy usage. Within the building, of course, are many of the LEED certification requirements, meaning that most of the material that we sourced from the building is within 400 miles. Also, we used recycled content. We use several, most of our buildings most of our bathrooms have ice dome, which is made out of recycled post-consumer waste glass, as well as making sure that most of the materials that we have within the building, if they're not of recycled content, they're from a renewable resource. We also have bike parking within the building, as well as many other features, including low VOC paints, and various other things. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Lana. Next, friend and colleague whom I've known for many, many years, John, I didn't even know your name was John. I'm always called Jana. Jana Lieber is president of World Trade Center Properties, LLC. Jana Lieber is responsible for managing all aspects of the Silverstein organization's efforts to rebuild at the World Trade Center site, including planning, design, and construction issues, business, financing, and legal matters, and public affairs, government, and community relations. Mr. Lieber previously served as Senior Vice President of Lawrence Rubin Company and is an independent consultant specializing in public-private development issues. From 1994 to 1998, Mr. Lieber worked with the U.S. Department of Transportation, finishing as Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy. Earlier in his career, Mr. Lieber practiced law and served in the office of Mayor Ed Koch and on the staff of the New Republic magazine. Jana is here to talk about 7 World Trade Center. Jana?
Let me see if I can master that. Is everybody well liquored up? I'm going to treat this like the rest of the World Trade Center project, which is unfolding. But I just want to thank Lynn and Vishaan for focusing this discussion on that topic of efficiency and sustainability, and especially about New York competitiveness, because this is a real issue for, I grew up in the city, a mile from here, and between 1970 and 1990, New York City produced 100 million square feet of new office space. But you like the design of all of those wedding cake Henry Roth office buildings, that was directly related to our success and our competitiveness. It was that moment when the city's economy was growing and growing and expanding and modernizing our office product, our office stock was a huge piece of that. Between 1990 and sometime in 2008, Dara, I'm looking at Dara, I think it was like less than 20 million square feet. So we had a dramatic drop-off in the production. That's related to economics. Strangely, we don't think of New York as a low-cost place for anything, right? But in terms of office space, Elena talked about $185 a foot. The Durst building achieved a rent that virtually nobody else has achieved. More broadly, though, the New York City office market is a relatively low-cost market compared to the world cities that we compete with: London, Moscow, Hong Kong, Dubai, even Bombay has less expensive office space than the United States, than New York City. So we have low rents, but we have high construction costs on very few sites because we're a pretty well-developed city, especially sites close to mass transit. And the result is that we have not been producing new office space, even as we are becoming, as a city and as an economy, more and more dependent on super high value added office jobs, which is what goes on in those brand new buildings. So this is a very dangerous mismatch, and one that's very threatening to our future, because you don't see it every day, but slowly companies are starting to think about, where do I put my jobs? It's not just, do I put the jobs in my company in New Jersey across the river because it's a little cheaper for some back office function. That used to be the competition thing. But now we're talking about the top tier front of house functions, those super high value added jobs that all of you are headed towards, and they might be in Hong Kong or London, and they might be somewhere else. And that's terrible, terrible risk for the city. If you're passionate about New York, that's a real danger to us. And it is in that context that what is unfolding downtown is actually pretty exciting, because what happened is on the backside of the tragedy of 9/11, we've had an opportunity to kind of break that market dysfunction, because there was insurance and there was a limited amount of tax-free financing, which kind of changes the economics of building office buildings, which are otherwise so daunting in a conventional development. And in the Bank of America Tower, which Helena referred to, also was, I don't know if it was make or break for them, because they were able to benefit from some of those post-9/11 tax-exempt financing sources as well. But it is a very, very important opportunity for us to get some new office space, some great office space, and to start to produce the kind of space we need for our future. So with that long introduction, I'm going to bring it back to what Vishaan asked me to discuss, which is 7 World Trade Center, which is the first building to rise at the World Trade Center site after 9/11, although it was the last building to be destroyed on 9/11. On the left, you have the old 7 World Trade Center, which Cyrus Silverstein developed in the 80s, in the early 80s, after the Port Authority had finished the main World Trade Center site. Folks remember, they had some land that was just to the north of the site, and they RFP'd it to a number of developers. Silverstein was the winner, and built that building, which was big in footprint, and it actually kind of, like, consistent with the World Trade Center site, the planning model of the World Trade Center site, kind of, in some ways functioned, it was a successful building, but it functioned a little bit as a barrier, because it kind of straddled streets, and when you were coming from Grand Street, you like ran into it like it was a wall. It didn't preserve the grid, which was true of the whole World Trade Center era. After 9/11, on 9/11, the building was destroyed. Debris from the collapse of the North Tower ignited it. And you see after the recovery what was left on that shot on the right. But you can see Greenwich Street coming south and how it ran into the site, correct? All right, now I'm going to do this all wrong. What's the one that says next? Is that a good one to push? All right, there we go. But what we did, instead of building the exact same footprint, we built a thinner building so that Greenwich Street, now I know what that button is for, Greenwich Street could be reintroduced and to come back through the World Trade Center site. This was a really important idea. Not only are we going to build a great building, hopefully, a sustainable building, a building that will be competitively advantageous for the city, but we wanted to restore the grid, to put this area back in New York, on the street grid. And bringing the street back was very important. Result is we got this little triangle here, which we built into a park. It's, it has greenery that is watered by recycled rainwater. It's very sustainable. Equally important, it's kind of become a place of respite. In all of the crazy construction that's going on all around downtown, it's one place that feels finished and the people, especially construction workers, can come and sit and relax and just be outside as downtown is coming back together. It's a building on a different footprint, as I said. It was a little bit taller. We lost about 400,000 feet in the process, but it has resulted in a very successful building. You see it's slightly slimmer. One of the interesting things about this is this was done with very little information. It was a time of flux. There was no clarity about what the World Trade Center site, the main site where the Twin Towers were, was going to become. There was very little clarity about many, many things downtown. But there was a Con Ed substation in the base of the building that needed to be rebuilt. It was not on the World Trade Center site, and Larry had free hand. And this is one of those cases where I think, I hope it's not boastful, but the developer's determination and initiative kind of broke through some of the normal barriers to getting development done in New York. And we just started redesigning. We just went. Everybody got together on this idea of putting the streets back, but other than that, we just went. And it was a time before, like the Durst building in Times Square, before even the LEED system of green certification was in place fully. People weren't clear. The New York Times Tower, which is a successful building, didn't even go for a LEED certification because it wasn't clear that that was the standard. We too were developing in a time of flux where there was uncertainty about standards. But we did it, we got it up, and it was finished 4 years later, which we sometimes remind other participants in the much longer rebuilding of the main World Trade Center site. So it opened in May 2006. Everybody said, Larry, you're out of your mind, we're building a building, no one will rent it. It's going to be a failure, you're going to bring the market down, because as Vishan points out, people think of office space generically. We got a lot of awards. And more importantly, got tenants. And it filled up with great tenants, but most important, there were tenants that spoke to this idea that a new modern building with some of these efficiencies and sustainable features was going to be attractive to a slightly different kind of tenant. Yes, it had old financial services like Moody's in it, which occupies about 25 or 30% of the building, but it also has attracted a lot of branding and advertising and companies that are driven by New York brain power. They've got to be here, they want to be here for the brain power, but they don't want to pay Park Avenue hedge fund rents. And so we're really in a building like this where we can offer a little lower price point, protecting New York's economy. I'd like to believe that we are doing a lot to protect jobs that might otherwise be forced out of New York. The way we're starting to hear about artists being forced out of New York, these jobs might be forced to leave New York if they couldn't find a place that, one, is affordable, but two, kind of speaks to what is going to attract that kind of talent. And it's not just about the fact that it's stylish and modern, it's also about the efficiency of new space. And I want to talk about that for just a moment. New space is more efficient because when you have many fewer columns to work around as you lay out your space, you can, in fact, rent less space. And it's a very significant cost-saving factor. It gives you more flexibility because these new buildings, and I assume that the ones that the other participants are talking about is the same case, don't have a lot of the core walls, which surround the elevators and the stairs and everything that's in the center of the building, don't have a lot of penetration. So you can put your planning, the desks and the files and everything you're doing, office space, right up against the core wall because you don't have to preserve the access to the core. So those kinds of efficiencies, those kinds of flexibility are huge for the kinds of companies that lay out very flexible space so that people can constantly be interacting and communicate. We don't necessarily lay out space in an old-fashioned way where you just have one closed office after another. So this is an important piece of matching up office space flexibility with what kinds of jobs we want to keep in New York. The other thing that's going on, and that people are starting to pick up on, is that the creative class workforce that's driving New York's economy now doesn't necessarily live where the workforce of past live. They don't all, Long Island and Westchester and Southern Connecticut are diminishing as a percentage of our workforce, our white-collar workforce. And Brooklyn, where I live, and Brooklyn and New Jersey are growing. That is Brooklyn and New Jersey and Lower Manhattan, for those who are in the highest end of the economic spectrum, are the growth areas for our workforce. If you ask, I think there was the guy at Ed City Habitats was asked, when people come to you looking for a place to rent in New York City, where they want to live, he says everybody walks in saying they want to live downtown. They don't all end up living downtown, but they all walk in saying they want to live downtown. That's certainly not the New York I grew up in. It's changed. So the gravity has moved downtown, and downtown is more convenient to that new workforce. And that is also supporting this very exciting development of downtown from a place where it was just all financial services to a new model. We have, I'm not going to, Helena really covered very thoroughly the sustainable features that our new buildings have. They have one thing that we do not have, which is a cogeneration plant. Larry Silverstein and Jerry Spire put a cogeneration plant in an old building on West 42nd Street, 11 West 42nd Street, 30 years ago. And what happened? Con Ed sued them. They said, you can't produce power, we have a monopoly. This dynamic of cogeneration, not necessarily as much as we all believe in it, I'm not sure that Con Ed gets it yet. It's one of the challenges we all face because there's some very important green initiatives that still go up against the regular utilities, and you come up against them. We were unable to do that because Con Ed was in the base of the building, but other than that, we have almost all of the same features that Helena mentioned. And on the topic of how much does it cost a fair amount more in 7 World Trade Center. But Larry, interestingly, the DERS, to their credit, were visionaries and have been involved with the environmental movement for some years. Larry is an outdoorsman, a sportsman, and very sensitive to air quality because he has asthma, but didn't have that same history. But he saw this as a business issue. He said, this is coming, these standards, the expectation of green is coming from around the world. The European Union's already adopted it. International companies want it and expect it. And we have to be smart enough to see what's coming. And it's actually turned out to be true. One of the larger tenants that I mentioned on that list before, at the bottom, West LB, top of the 7 World Trade Center, top 3 floors, a German investment bank who said we have to be in a green building because that's our corporate commitment. So they chose 7 World Trade over the other option. So that's, I think, what was kind of a market changer was that Larry was perceived, our organization was perceived as business people who made the green decision in part, hopefully not strictly, but in large part for business reasons, apart from the ideological rectitude of it. So the final thought I want to leave you with is, we're talking about competitiveness. What's exciting about downtown, and why I think it represents a new model for our city, and will make us more competitive, is the urban model that we've all been talking about. It has the most mass transit. Every subway in New York City comes there, exception of the G train, which doesn't come to Manhattan at all. It all comes to Lower Manhattan. The ferry comes a block away from the World Trade Center. And it is 94% mass transit commuter population. There's no other business district that intensity of residential right around that core new business district. So this is a one-of-a-kind, walk-to-work, mass transit intensive experiment in having true mixed-use 24/7 development. And I think that is going to make our city much more attractive because people today are moving away from the long commute model that has dominated so much of development nationally in the United States and internationally. And they want top quality, top earners, top talent wants to be, not to waste a ton of time traveling and to be close to work. This is an image of 7 World Trade Center in the background. In the foreground, the Bank of New York Operations Center, which is an SOM building by David Child. And then a brand new condo with Bed Bath & Beyond, Barnes & Noble, and Whole Foods in it. And next to it, PS 234, which on the numbers is the highest ranked public school in the city of New York. So this is a really exciting, one-of-a-kind kind of proximity that's being developed. And I think that it will also be part of preserving our competitiveness, as well as, I wasn't supposed to talk about it, but it's kind of the rest of the World Trade Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. Brian Schwaberl, a good friend, is the former vice president of real estate and facilities planning. Brian Schwaberl will take global responsibility for leasing and managing Hearst Corporation's portfolio of properties. In October 2006, he opened the $500 million 46-story glass and steel tower that is the home of Hearst Corporation's world headquarters, the first gold-rated occupied green building in New York City. The Lord Norman Foster designed tower has been described by architectural critic Paul Goldberger as the most beautiful skyscraper to go up in New York since 1967. Apologies to both of our other panelists. Schwaberl is named Corporate Real Estate Executive of the Year by the National Association of Corporate Real Estate Executives and is a member of the Real Estate Board of New York. He is a former editorial board member of the Journal of Corporate Real Estate and former New York board member of Cornell Global. Schwaberl has also lectured at Columbia New York University and has been recognized as a top-rated faculty member of the Institute for Corporate Real Estate.
Geez, that guy better be good. Yeah. Thanks for coming today, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. So we're going to talk about the Hearst Tower, and it's very easy to get to from here. You can get on the 109 and get off the Columbus Circle and walk 1 block over. It's a pretty exciting tower, but it's visionary from its very founder, Mr. Hearst. Mr. Hearst, most of you would know, started the newspaper empire. Some of you might remember his grandfather, who had investments in gold and copper mines out in the West. But really, the world headquarters for the Hearst Corporation, which owns magazines, newspapers, radio, television, cable entities like ESPN, Lifetime, A&E, and many other properties, is here in New York City. And Mr. Hearst really was a visionary, and he wanted something in his original building here in New York which had the qualities of a theater and where sculpture and was an important factor. A notable building, something that would distinguish it from on the skyline on account of conspicuous architectural character. Well, in 1927, that's what he wanted, and this is what he got. Next to it, I think he would have been quite excited about what was built upon his original foundation, both literally and figuratively. Mr. Hearst thought way back when, in the original Hearst magazine building, that he should add extra foundation into the building itself that would support a skyscraper going up above it. It's above the Columbus Circle station, and for many, many years, this was the world headquarters of the Hearst Corporation. They had Good Housekeeping Institute at the time, but it basically was a magazine building for Esquire, Red Book, Cosmo, Popular Mechanics, and a number of other entities. But 21 years ago, I was recruited to work at Hearst. I had a background in real estate and banking and in politics, specifically West Side politics. I had worked for the Senate Minority Leader and a number of other people in the Senate. But 21 years ago, they dangled this idea in front of me. You know, Brian, we're thinking about building a headquarters. What do you think? This could be very exciting if you came to work with us in our real estate department. It didn't take 21 years of my career to build the Hearst Tower, but it was an idea that came from its inception. And picking on Vishan's point, these things take time, but time and luck and excitement and how you use that when it comes your way, and someone in this room is going to have the opportunity to have it come their way, is how do you make the most of the opportunity when you get it? How do you innovate and make your building, one next to it, that's Mr. Hearst's name on it, not mine, but how do you make it the most exciting, smart, and innovative building possible? We were in 10, 12, 13 on a given day buildings around Manhattan, and Helena, who and her family was just quite visionary. She's correct when she says, if you're going to be in the real estate business and you're going to manage buildings, you have to go around to them, you have to visit them, you have to become mayor of cheese. I mean, you have to know everything that's going on in your building if you're in the facility area to be able to make it work. Look at these buildings on the map here. Look at where we're located within the Columbus Circle campus. They grew their businesses. They expanded. They bought new magazines. They founded new magazines. They moved into internet commerce. They never thought what cable was going to begin, what it would turn out to be. It was a germ of an idea. So you started in these incubation spaces, and then some of them take off. In my case, I had a background before I went into politics as a reporter. So these weren't widgets to me. Each one of these businesses and where they were located were exciting. It's a sexy business to be in. But do any of those buildings look sexy to you? No. The idea was, how do you build a workforce for the future? How do you make that workforce competitive? And this is even before you get into the new age of social media and everyone chasing Facebook, everyone chasing Twitter, everyone facing something else that's coming along. I had a unique opportunity to, let's put this in context when this happened. So I'm managing the Hearst portfolio, not just in New York, but around the world. And we were moving businesses out of New York during the Dinkins administration. Columbus Circle was a mess. It was embankment of homeless people. It really wasn't a proper environment to grow businesses. The crime was at an all-time high. Around the time Giuliani came into office, things started to clean up. There was more of a pro-business approach to things. The Time Warner Center was under consideration. And the idea was, okay, what are we going to do? Let me see, how do we go back? Let's see. Go back. There we go. Back again. What are we going to do with this airspace above the old building? All of a sudden, developers were approaching me and saying, you know what, I'll pay you $150 million if you get out of that freaking building and I can build condos there. When someone all of a sudden starts approaching you and you realize that air is worth $150 million, it's a very unique structure here in New York City that they have. Because this was already a landmark building. This was a building that had, as of right, in the ULIP process, the ability to build above it. You say, wow, air's worth that much in New York? What can I do with this? Again, the impetus comes on you. What can you do with it? You go into your bosses, the CEO, et cetera, and you say, you know what? At the time I was president of the National Association of Corporate Real Estate Executives. You say, we need to start thinking about the future, how to be competitive, what the workforce of tomorrow is going to be, because this isn't going to cut. They turn to you and they say, really? You're out of your mind. If it ain't broke, why fix it? But at the same time, they say, well, why don't you go forward and see what you can do with it? At that point, you approach the city, you look at them with, you dust off the old plans, because they had tried this 3 or 4 times or thought about it, including when Mr. Hearst was alive. We go, okay, city, what do you think of this? The city goes, I don't know. If you're going to build anything, you better start thinking about something innovative. And they say, you know what you really need to be doing? You need to be thinking outside the box. You need to be thinking world-class architects, and some of those exist around the globe. Hearst, being who they were able to travel around the world, look at architects from Japan and China, from Germany, and a few Americans as well. But they settled upon Lord Norman Foster. But Foster is an interesting individual. He knew how to marry the old and the new. And there's a view from Central Park. He also had a complete background in sustainability. Because as Jana mentioned before, European standards are far more advanced in terms of sustainability ideas than American standards were. And this is very important, he spoke English. And I say it's very important because communication is key between your client and your architect. And so there were times in meetings with the Lord that neither side understood what they were talking about. And we were speaking English. So imagine how complicated it is when you go beyond that. But once you have a meeting of the minds, and you understand your client, and your client understands you, there's great things that you can do. Because if you're ever given the opportunity, like I was, to leave a lasting legacy to the New York City skyline, why would you build anything less than the very best? Why wouldn't you push the envelope to make it the healthiest building possible? So at the time, I used to meet quite regularly with the head of real estate for the New York Times, the head of real estate for Bloomberg, and the head of real estate for leaving one communications company now. What do you think what it was? Another what? IAC as well. And we were all benchmarking. Which one?
Advanced? Condé
Yes, Condé Nast was already in your beautiful tower at the time. They had really progressed a little further along than us. But I did benchmark against them. The point is, we were all thinking about building buildings. We would get together, we'd talk about things, we'd benchmark things, we'd look at pricing of things, and we'd go forward. You have to put it in context of the time. It was after 9/11. So how do you make your building safe? Where are the innovations for safety, especially in a tower? The building codes didn't exist at the time. Your communications company, where are you building the wireless technology? How expensive is that wireless technology? Why wouldn't you spread it throughout the building? It'd be insane if you didn't do that today. But at the time, it's a wireless technology. What's that? We want to be able to take your office anywhere within the building, and it moves with it. The ability to bring all this light to open space up. Helena talked great about LEED certification. At the time, you couldn't find 3 or 4 people in the city that knew about LEED, let alone explain it. Now I think it's going to be commonplace. And Bloomberg, who didn't build his headquarters to green sustainable standards, today is leading the pack in terms of where sustainability would be. And if you think you're going to be able to attract the best and the brightest, the youngest people, and not have an environment which makes them feel that you're giving something back to the environment, that you're a progressive company, that's going to be far from it. And that's one of the key indicators that people take a look at when they're looking at jobs, notwithstanding the recession. And it's a simple thing. How do you get cleaner air? How do you get more light in? How do you take care of the resources that are given to you? So when you bring up this idea of green to your CEO, he goes, what are you talking about? Recycled parts, right? No, we didn't do that. It's insane. Well, the building's full of recycled parts. You got to the point where they understood it, so by the time that you're building a spa, or I call it a spa, but a gym for your employees within the building, he can name 5 different types of sustainable woods to be in the sauna. So it's all about educating your people where it's going. So what is the end result? You look at this open plan. Before, everyone was hiding in a Dilbert cubicle. No one was talking to each other. They were all across different city streets. So Jan was talking about how much people you can get in per square feet. You see that there? All the open plan, the buildings on the side, the glass, the light comes in. People have views of Central Park, the Hudson River, and the Manhattan skyline. It's about thinking out of the box and making it try and come along. And where are you going to be innovative? That's what you do. The sky is the limit. You just go for it, and you try and put together the right people to help you. You look at examples like Helena's, Fort Bearers, who did a fantastic job over at 4 Times Square. You look at developments outside of the box, European developments, other places around the world. You benchmark with people, and then you just make your case. And if we don't do that in New York City, we're going to be in a great deal of trouble. But I think we're on our way. Thank you.
All right, terrific. Can we get the lights on, please? I'm going to ask everyone to come up, and then Lynn and I are going to moderate some discussion. And while everyone's getting their seat, I'm going to introduce Lynn. Lynn Scanlon is a longtime friend, has inventor and short professor of real estate development at Columbia Business School, where she's director of the Paul Winston Center for Real Estate in the MBA Real Estate Program. His most recent position marks a return to Columbia, where she's been professor of finance and economics for more than 12 years. I don't know if we read all of this, because I want to get to the discussion, but I just want to say that Lynn and I have known each other for a long time. It was a great pleasure planning this event together because it really marries, I think, the interests of both programs. So with that, I'm going to send over to you have a first question for our student? Yes, I think.
First, I'd like to add my 2 cents. Welcome, and say how happy I am to have a panel that focuses on this issue. I couldn't agree more with Janet's comments about putting this in context of what these buildings as forerunners mean to the city and need to be competitive. Everybody wants to live in New York, yet we're not building enough office space for the jobs that we want. A question that occurs to me as I listen to all 3 presentations, that in each period of time when you built your buildings, you were doing something that had barely been done before, at least in this country. And so you were making decisions on every level, design, business, on untried materials. How fast is this sector going? And, we made decisions not that long ago, in the big scheme of things, and I'm sure there are advancements now. How do you deal with the fact that you're trying to make rational decisions in a field that is rapidly changing? I have a perception it's rapidly changing, and how do you know when you know enough to make the decision now? I mean, how fast is the technology to bring buildings?
I think Helena's building is fabulous and uses a lot of those advancements. And then it will be a laboratory to see what works and doesn't work. She was brave enough to put other people we think twice about. In my case, I had very few examples. So I was basing it on what was existing in very small groups of pockets out in California, maybe Portland, Oregon. A lot of what was happening in Europe, in Germany, in London, and in France. But the idea of building a healthy building and a more energy efficient building is really just that. I think people overwork it. So anytime that I reached a roadblock on how to approach it, I would say, well, how much are we spending on AV? How much does that elevator system cost? Why do they go for this, but they're not looking at the better air quality system that you're going to provide for employees, and how much healthier they're going to be?
So that was your benchmark.
Yeah, and I think that technology has improved greatly. There are many more choices out there, and there are a lot of people selling things. You have to be careful what works, what doesn't work, but it's easy to benchmark. If you're not shy and what you look at on the internet or elsewhere, it's amazing what can be brought to you.
I think for us, there was an addition to what Bryant described. We got very interested in the emerging science, which is out there and is growing, about the relationship between the quality of buildings, the greenness of buildings, the caliber of the atmosphere, and employee productivity. There's a recent study, there's some work at the federal level about this. And when we sat down to design the buildings on the main World Trade Center site, after 7 had been done, but we actually assembled a bunch of experts on this issue, and we started a dialogue. What is the relationship between caliber of the air quality, the access to natural light, and other features, and employee productivity? And there is really growing science about this. San Diego State did a pretty systematic review of green buildings nationwide, and I think what they found is that the tenants provided evidence that they have a reduction in absenteeism about 25 to 30%, and they're actually, in addition to that, getting more productivity out of employees who are there. So people work better in a better environment. And when you think about I don't mean to go on, but when you think about the economic relationship between the cost of real estate and the cost of the people who are sitting in the chairs, it's a no-brainer. Because the cost of people sitting in the chair, if somebody's including benefits, are going to say $250,000 a year, which is not a crazy number for a New York top-quality office building. They're, $1,000 a foot. The real estate may be at the high end in your new building, $150 a foot. So in most buildings,
That's it. Did you see her now, by the way? I don't know this is real.
no one's getting $150.
Yeah.
It's clean. We'll sustain fantasy. But the point is, there's a 10-to-1 relationship, roughly speaking. So if you can juice productivity even slightly, and if you can attract a better caliber of talent, writ large, you've changed the economics of a business much more than the back and forthing over $1 or $2 or $5 a foot in real estate. So that is part of what I think has become such a powerful engine for the business community to embrace sustainability and high-quality buildings.
So I think actually, in looking at 4 Times Square, the decisions made about 4 Times Square was first made by a charrette, which was the first time that had been brought to the decision-making process for the Durst organization. And that part of that charrette was actually, we brought in the operational staff, the engineers who would be working within the building, as well as the people who would be supervising that staff, as well as Tishman Construction and the architects. And at that time, we didn't have a tenant, but later in the process, we made sure that they were a part of that. Because in operating a green or sustainable building, that's the most important part. As you know, existing buildings, LEED certification will increase the amount of time that they're going to review your building. So it doesn't matter how green the technology you're using, you need to make sure that your staff has been brought in early to that process, understands it, and then goes forward with it. 4 Times Square is a really interesting case study because we looked at buying panels, solar panels. We have solar panels on the 38th floor, on all 4 sides of the building, 38th floor and up, in the middle of the building. And those solar panels were actually made in somebody's garage. We also put fuel cells in the building, which was not a success. The reason they were not a success is because nobody else followed the path. No other developers started to use fuel cells within New York City. It has become very difficult to maintain those fuel cells. So in our practice, we like to kick the tires. We try and we try and we try again. This table is actually made out of bamboo. When building the Helena, coincidentally named, we tested bamboo. And the way that we tested it, we put it into a vacant floor, and we started pouring all this stuff on it, stepping on it, seeing what it would do, and it ended up cupping. So we went to a certified renewable forest service.
I just was wondering if you could pick up on Janet's point about employee productivity and efficiency. I know at first they started measuring this.
Yeah, a little dirty secret, Sean worked in the office for a little while,
Yeah.
so he knows about how much fun it is. Green isn't just all the light that pours in, although I distinctly remember a particular woman who was not a happy individual in her former office, and I had many encounters with her in her former office. And one day after we opened the tower, she came up to me and very seriously said to me, "Brian, what are they pumping into the air?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She goes, "There's something about the air." I said, "Well," I explained the filter, it's natural air coming in from outside, it's the cleanest air in New York City. She goes, "Yeah, but is there something else in it?" And I said, "No, absolutely not. It's just clean, pure air. It's nothing there." She goes, "I don't get it. I've never been happier." And it bothered her, but there was a because she had light pouring in from 2 sides where her office was located. And she was in the dark in the past. She preferred the dark back then, but now she understood all that light pouring in has an unbelievable effect. And that's what the earlier studies were talking about, children and test scores and what was happening. But your ability to see nature from, and the same is true at 7 World Trade. It's just, the views are spectacular. The Hudson construction site, other things that are going on. It just, for our younger people, you're asking retain and attract the oldest, besides the fact that
So few people looked at me and said the word younger.
yeah, that's
so
good. No, but they love being in the building, but one of the things is they don't get those views back in their apartments where they're one on top of each other. So, you know, what was really remarkable was how late our workforce stayed in the building. Because the views at night are just as spectacular, if not more so, than Manhattan skyline than when you're looking at Central Park or the Hudson. Now, everyone can't replicate that, but as I went around the country, any other leases that I was doing, you can't find gold LEED buildings or any sort of LEED buildings anywhere. It's becoming easier and I think marketable, actually. There's a race towards quality, so better companies will seek these out, and then you're going to see more of them. Developers are going to do it. But I would just look for as much light as possible, and then you know, I would bring in the recycled materials. At the time when we built the furniture systems, besides getting rid of the builder cubes that everyone was hiding behind, bringing them down to a level where everyone could see each other, right, and communicate. Oh God, you know, we actually have that many people in the office. You know, that kind of stuff. Where's the sales force? What are they doing? The furniture system was all made out of FSC certified, with the largest amount in the United States. And you just put it out to bid. You know, they're all fighting for the competition to be able to service you. And then you negotiate. That's what you do for a living. And you figure out how far across the price board is this from something else. How much prettier can it be? And if they can't provide, then you're not going to work with them. And you know, at the end of the day, you're able to negotiate services. I was kind of breaking the mold for new stuff, but God knows I gave enough tours to everyone afterwards, and they sold so much more product after it was in our building. You know, and that's not just for American companies; that's from all around the world, because it's a better office in the long run.
I got on something Helene said when you talked about fuel cells. They were hard to maintain. I'm curious as to what impact your buildings have had on the industry, your colleagues in the industry, and how they looked at these buildings, and to what extent they've been influenced by them. You know, that you all been pioneers in building these buildings. And how many of your tours are to colleagues who want to see what you've done so that they can think seriously about this?
So when my father, Douglas Durst, first built 4 Times Square, many people called him out and said it was not a business decision. I'll hold that back there. But it has become something that people realize that it makes a lot of economic sense. And so for the first 4 years, there was a huge building boom in 2000 to 2004. It was a great disappointment not to see many buildings following suit. There was several outliers. But after 2005, it became evident that becoming LEED certified became in vogue and that it was very marketable. So I think it's been people have started to follow suit. Recently, I was at a talking engagement in DC, and that New York City is starting to actually lag behind. New York State is lagging behind several other states in the United States. Colorado, Denver, Colorado, California, DC are all following suit and starting to build and have built by far more LEED certified buildings.
And you know why DC is, right? Because they don't pay government workers that much money. And so they're in it for a reason. But if you don't provide them better offices, we're all screwed. So really, way back when, I don't know if it was under the Reagan administration or it was probably under the Clinton administration, they started projecting how many people were going to be leaving government service, how they were going to attract people into government service, and it wasn't going to be with salaries. So they said, we better start upgrading our buildings. We better start making better buildings. And I think they've been a pretty good effort at it.
So,
I think the one thing that has become clear is that it's surprisingly quickly having a LEED certified building has become synonymous for a new office building, a new office tower, at least in the central business district. And that happened in a few short years. What I think Helene is right is that it became something that people now expect. that was one thing that happened very quickly, is people weren't sure which standard it was going to take, and it ended up being this U.S. Green Building Council, so-called LEED standard, and now everybody gravitates towards it.
Aren't there pretty big distinctions between what much is put out there as green building, quote unquote, and LEED certified being a fairly low bar compared to, I mean, when you see Helena's basement, I mean, it's a basement. I mean, this stuff's pretty cool, and it's way, I mean, you know, just for me, yeah.
I think you're right, there are different levels. Obviously, LEED has its own, platinum, gold, silver, certified levels. But what's generally happening is that people are, there's also variation in between developer building, which is your building, spec building for the shop. So you're getting LEED certification for a building that's built with that, not for a particular tenant versus a building for a specific use, versus buildings. A lot of the LEED standard was developed with sort of office parks in mind. So they've had to develop it with more urban, dense development as a standard. One of the things I always argue for is there should be more credit given to proximity to mass transit. The fact that you use recycled rainwater to irrigate the 5 shrubs outside your building in an office park should be less of a point or a value in the LEED system than whether or not you're close to mass transit. And they've tried to evolve that. It's still a system in evolution, but I think the important thing is it's dragged the business community broadly along very, very quickly, and that's a plus.
So I just want to stay on that point for 1 second. So something that I was extremely happy to see in all of the presentations is you all kind of gave equal weight to issues of neighborhood as you did to issues of technology, which I was very pleased to see, and we didn't even plan that, which I think was terrific. And it was just interesting to me. I mean, Helena, you started with your family's tradition. I thought it was great, especially to be able to walk to all of your buildings in order to manage them, and just sort of, right, and then, and Brian, you talked about the whole transformation of Columbus Circle, and Jim, I mean, that shot down Greenwich Street, it's just, I live like a block from that shot. It's an incredible mix, you're absolutely right, in terms of what's available to you right there. But, you know, when you look out at the future of New York, and you've all had experience with buildings that are not these green buildings, right? I mean, you showed the old 7 World Trade Center, right? You talked about the old Hearst Tower, and you certainly know this from other parts of your portfolio. And Jana, you mentioned that from 1970 to 1990 that we've seen 100 million square feet of space, which is largely not only not green, but, you know, probably fairly miserable by a lot of the standards that we're talking about here tonight. You know, as you look forward, where do you think we've got sufficient room for growth, right, at a large scale for the kinds of buildings you're talking about, past the Trade Center site and Hudson Yards and a couple of other key sites that's going to give us maybe 10 of these buildings in total when all is said and done? I mean, you know, do you really see the capacity out there?
Sure.
All of it.
Capacity market-wise or
Physical
resource-wise?
capacity. Well, we were talking about land assemblage earlier. Do you see the physical capacity in the city, right, to build the office stock that we need to, you know, to accomplish the things you're all talking about?
It's definitely a very tough question because you have to, I think we should look at first the infrastructure that we have in New York City and Manhattan specifically. And there's the issue with the CSOs. There's also another issue with solid waste, as well as the solid waste, if you think about where that's getting trucked out of and who is being impacted by solid waste. And then what we could be doing, what we could be doing with solid waste as far as how we could be providing additional energy. The reason that Denmark and Germany and Northern European countries do so well on energy reduction and landfill, diversion to landfill, is because they're using their biosolids as a source of energy. So I think if we're looking at it from a resource point of view, I think it's first taking a look at the major infrastructure that New York City has, and first understanding what we are doing to be impacting that. I don't think it's on an individual developer level at that point. As you know, there's about 12 million square feet that's out there to be developed on the Hudson Yards. But I don't know know if that would be the best thing for New York City, because we'd be already impacting an overused and fairly old infrastructure system.
Well, I think we make good points. I would say that we take infrastructure-wise, which is I think that we have to do it by focusing on the transportation infrastructure. That's where I've come a little bit. And we have this great mass transit system, but we aren't focusing our development around it enough. And I'm like the minority of one on Atlantic Yards, which I live not far from, but support. My only beef is they haven't preserved enough sites for office buildings. A mass transit hub of that caliber ought to be where we put jobs. There's no reason that somebody who lives in Crown Heights should have to go to New Jersey to get a back office job. We should be doing more, I believe, to preserve. The problem in New York is that you don't have any development sites close to mass transit, so there ought to be a public policy effort to protect some of the available land or to create some sites by condemnation or through governmental intervention that are close to mass transit, because that is ultimately the threat to our development model, is that we need to leverage what we've got in mass transit and build more as well, build more mass transit like the 7-line extension as well. So I think for me that's the linchpin.
I think in addition to those points, I wonder what your ideas are on how much flexibility there exists within the existing stock to make changes to some of the buildings to retrofit them in a way that, while maybe not a pure substitute for a brand new building, would be a far greater enhancement to productivity and health, because we have to live with that stuff. I mean, the new buildings are important, but it's not the only way to get better office space or better residential space. Where is the technology of retrofitting buildings?
So we have 10 office buildings total, and I think about 5 of them were built before 1960. And the major issue there is space constraints. So to be able to put in the ice chiller plant, to be able to put in all these wonderful technologies, we went 80 feet deep into the ground for One Bryant Park, and the entire square footage of the building is about 2 acres. Or the footprint of the building is about 2 acres. So to be able to put in additional technology, you need to be able to have the space, and it's those constraints that are the most condemning. The other side of that coin is the facade and the therm load that you're impacting. How much heat and how much cool air are you losing in the summer and the winter months?
But I do think, and Brian, you manage a broad portfolio, so I'd like to know 2 things, but I do think that the pace of technology on retrofit is really picked up. I mean, there's all of a sudden a level of interest. There are some incentives, although they're not as big as they ought to be. There's discussion about growing those incentives, and the cost is starting to come down quickly on the retrofit. It is, as Elena says, it's very difficult with buildings where you can't control the temperature because the windows just don't permit it. The facade of the building doesn't permit it. As much as you can upgrade the mechanical system, some of those basic realities do.
But you could risk it.
You just have to look at the Empire State Building, right, where they make these changes. So they're able to do it. And why are they doing it? They're doing it to compete.
Yeah, the
Otherwise, they're
demand
not
has
going
come.
to be able to attract attendance.
But what is the Class B building?
That's not for me to comment on. It's a great location.
Oh,
It's
so,
a
anyway,
large building. I think
I think they're doing an extraordinary job. I'm just saying that yes, you can retrofit some of that stock, I agree, but there's a point at which, there is some threshold moment at which, because of column width or floor spacing and so forth, that you're not going to make it into a Class A building, right?
Well, it's not a matter of making it only Class A.
Right.
Because, yes, the configuration, and the columns, all that, is structurally limited. But if the idea is to improve existing space,
Yep.
are there cost-effective ways to?
You're discounting the fact that change isn't constant, and people are coming up with new ideas, and we're learning what works in other buildings and what doesn't work. When people said to me, that's a folly. Where are you going with this? You're just a tree hugger. And I'd say to them, no, you really don't understand. There are case studies that you can look at that they're going to hear in the United States Then you can look at the Hearst building. So in 4 buildings, we surpassed every energy projection saving that we thought we were going to save. You asked me about retaining and attracting the very best talent. The executives are competing tremendously by getting the young, the best, and the brightest in that building. One of the first things they look at is their commitment to green. The message about green went beyond just the building, where they green their production supply of newspaper supplies and magazines. They launched green websites. They introduced all sorts of other things. I think as people become educated, they understand that there's more opportunities to do different things, and they move in the direction of what works. So eventually, some of these older stock buildings are going to have to change.
And there's some that are probably going to come down.
If they're planned.
Yeah, that's right.
And
Which is not hard to hang under, but you know, it's going to have to happen in some places.
And, you know, New York used to tear down to rebuild.
Yeah.
We have a lot of big expensive buildings, but we also have a lot of buildings that probably come down with a good assemblage.
And it also makes economic sense because heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems consume the majority of a lot of managers' power as well as electrical load, which goes directly to your dollars, right? So if you can, and how most old buildings work is it's with their HVAC system, you turn a light switch on and off. You either have the heat on and the whole building is getting heated, or you turn the light switch on and the whole building is getting air conditioned. There's really no ability to be able to have a certain tenant have air conditioning. And so and that's called constant air volume. And so as tenants go away, as tenants leave, it makes it easier for managers and landlords to go throughout a building and look at their HVAC system and change it to variable air volume system, which gives people the ability essentially as a dimmer switch, so that they're able to have their heat go into one floor opposed to a vacant floor, or their air conditioning is the same thing, and that will reduce cost as well as save on energy loads.
That's a very key point, but it's new technology, and it's becoming to light, and then people are taking advantage of it. And she just explained it to you in a very clear, concise way, not in architect speak, not in engineering gobbledygook. You know, and at the end of the day, what's happening? You're saving energy and you're saving money. It's a simple concept when you just break it down into where things are going. You know, I assembled a Plan B site for Hearst, so they didn't build the tower. It was a smaller building that they were thinking about. At the end of the project, it contained several sites that I was able to pull together, and then we sold for Hearst for $170 million. Right? But the buildings that we assembled together, which included an old Hearst building that was in Stockner, they were old, dilapidated, and made no sense whatsoever. So eventually, when the economy turns around, Boston Property is going to be able to build next to or across the street, 2 blocks away from the Hearst Tower, a stunning building. What happens, and Bishan knows this, is that, you know, things move to like places. We're along a great subway line, and there's a lot of great transportation, proximity to the park. There will be a transformation of the West Side skyline.
I know there's some questions out there in the audience. Maybe we can turn up the lights a bit more.
Thank you all for coming. My name is Raymond. I have 2 questions. The first question is, as developers, I would like to know how do you structure the lease so that, I know you all talked about sustainability being a good marketing strategy, but how do you ensure that tenants follow the right guidelines and they use the building properly so that you get the savings? I'm actually doing a case study on 4 Times Square right now. I know you have the tenant guideline, but I don't think that really helps the tenant responsible for their actual behavior. It's more of a guideline. And the second question is, I can see a range from building owner to stack building design, stack building development. So my second question is, are there any difference in the way you look at sustainability and energy saving from those 2 perspectives?
So as far as tenant guidelines, they're very difficult. So when we first opened up the 4 Times Square, we were actually giving demerits out to our tenants for those who didn't recycle. And if you've ever had to have a vice president explain to a cleaning person about how they didn't want to get a demerit, it's not a pretty situation. And so what we do is we do things that they don't even realize. We've been working now with Condé Nast to reduce their plastics usage by taking out, everybody has a desk, right? And you have two bins. One bin has a plastic liner and the other bin doesn't have a plastic liner, and that's just for paper. We told all of our tenants in our portfolio that we were removing the plastic liner. That's reducing plastic right there. That also affects the amount of paper that's being properly used as far as being recycled. Paper is 80% of waste that comes out of an office building that's not a cafeteria is paper. That is the most valuable material that comes through the New York City recycling besides steel as well as any type of metal. But you're getting mostly paper out of an office building. So the cleaner you can have your paper, with the less contaminants, the less food, the more it's going to be recycled. The second way is that we have composting. Condé Nast Cafeteria has a composting operation, and none of this is ever realized by the tenants. And the third point is that we have a very strict green cleaning program. We maintain that all of this is very detailed stuff, sorry guys. We maintain that all our vacuum cleaners and all of the cleaning equipment that's used is well maintained, does not use a lot of energy. All of the cleaning products has low VOC, and we try to, whenever possible, put in paper products in the bathrooms that are made out of recycled content.
Well, I think that for us in a spec building, a multi-tenant building, I think that part of the challenge is to meet the tenants different. And they will respond differently to different kinds of standards. What we try to do is to educate them about the ways in which the building provides opportunities for them to save money and operate more effectively. And it can be as simple as just showing them how they, acquire as part of their fit-out a dimming system, a light dimming system, and really impressing on them how much that will save. Really the challenge is, and Brian, you may see this, is that for a lot of companies who are tenants, their building facilities people are not necessarily building operators. They're the people who kind of try to keep an office, the boss happy, and run a leased facility. So they're not necessarily, historically, have not been the people who are most cutting edge on technology, because they just paid the rent and operated and dealt with the landlord in an office building. So part of the challenge is to bring those people up the curve so that they understand the opportunities that are available to them in this building and how it's different from what they're accustomed to save money and to operate better. In addition to that, under the standards of the World Trade Center, we have sort of a formal system of their so-called exemplar space, where you actually show people, look, here are the carpet that you can buy that will help you to satisfy legal requirements. So you take them through the steps of showing them how they can be LEED certified for their fit, which is separate from the base building. We designed a building that didn't have tenant fit out. So that's part of the process as well. And it's worked in many cases. We have at the top of 7 World Trade Center, there's that German investment bank called SLB that I mentioned, and they did a LEED Platinum fit out, which is quite rare, the highest level of LEED on their fit out, and there are a few others who are following.
Yeah, I'll admit it, I'm an attorney, so I negotiate, I know how to do this. A green lease is very difficult, but you have choices. And in my case, as in charge of the portfolio, vast portfolio, when leases roll over, you can stay with the landlord or not stay with the landlord. There are certain landlords that have great reputations and are bringing their portfolios. If that becomes something that your own group is educated about, they'll move towards that. The same way that they look at location, the same way that they look at security, the same way that they look at numbers of factors, including price. It depends. But again, we were an owner-occupier, so it's easy. It's easy to make great choices when you own the building, and especially even easier once you understand it and you understand the benefits behind it. I invited to 500 or 1,000 lawyers in the room, right? They were interested in sustainability, they were interested in hospitality, they were interested in green leases, etc. I was absolutely shocked when I asked how many of the lawyers in the room had their AP certification. It was half the room. When I was doing the Hearst Tower, I was lucky I could find 5 lead AP people in New York City. And we're talking lead here, and it's not the be-all and end-all of sustainability. But we all understand what it means. At the time, we couldn't find anyone that understood what lead even meant. For me, it was just a guideline, right? So I had many different consultants, a gazillion consultants on the job, on a variety of different things. But when I went to the NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research Development Corporation, and asked for a grant to kickstart the green movement here in New York, because they had no signature no poster boy for a project like this on Manhattan skyline. The New York City should be embarrassed about the Santillana's building, that everyone was moving away from the standard instead of embracing it. It became easier, and then it becomes a better way to understand how to move towards it. You all don't have to have the latest and the greatest piece of technology, but you can move slowly and surely towards materials and other things to make your space a little bit more livable and breathable and better for the planet.
Two questions, I guess. It's probably more clear for Brian, since you're an owner-occupier, but what did you do with, I'm sure you made some effort to sort of secure the buy-in from their employees that were going to be outside the building? Also, have you tried to quantify your occupancy costs post-move-in?
Sure. If you had to replicate the space that we have today, you'd be very hard pressed. So I bought into a great market. Post 9/11, we were very afraid that everything was going to rush to the downtown. The price of steel, glass, every material was going to go through the roof. Boy, was that a mistake.
I wish.
Right? So instead, everyone stopped constructing. And so when we put bids out on the street, it was great. It was very easy for me to pick not only great talent, like the 18 of everyone that was out there, but 5 bids for every project, you could get great pricing. In terms of our own occupants that you asked about, they were just afraid of giving up their little fiefdoms. So you saw how many buildings there were. It was the Cosmo World in one building. It was Good Housekeeping. It was, the Monocle Lodge in the world of the Parkers Bazaar and another. My God, how would we actually be able to see on the roof? And there was this fear of other things. So the green wasn't anything that was really on the radar screen for them. That was helpful in the community, trying to sell it back. We were in the neighborhood for 80 years. We hope to be there for another 180 years. So in terms of getting community approvals from landmarks, from city planning, from the MTA, it was explaining how we were going to build a green building, which was going to be better for the neighborhood. It was the kicker, though, when they came in, that everybody embraced. So the CEO at a Thanksgiving event came up to me months after the building had opened and said to me, Brian, if you ever told me that everybody would be talking about the green elements of the building that we introduced, I would have thought you were nuts. He said, but it's just remarkable to me how big a difference it's made to the whole overall occupancy of the building. So it wasn't the lead architect, it wasn't Lord Malone Foster, it wasn't the design, it wasn't all these things. I mean, in totality it was, but at the end of the day, that was driving more of the discussion than anything else.
One last question.
In my opinion, I think that sustainability has a very important social component, and all of your buildings, I think, provide some really good social space, some public space to varying degrees of accessibility, but have a place where people can congregate. How valuable do you think that is in the future of buildings in New York? How do they, that relationship to the street provide space for people? How important is that?
I think it's absolutely vital. So if you take a look at what Bryant Park is, not the building, but Bryant Park. Bryant Park is an excellent cosmo of how people get together, they have lunch, and it gives the office workers a place to go. And Bryant Park has made the surrounding market much more valuable. And a great meter to see how well an area is doing is you can see how many women are walking around. So in Times Square, before the revitalization, there were only the women who were working were walking around. The rest of the population walking on the streets were men. And so for people to feel safe to go to work, they didn't want to go there because you just didn't feel safe. So not only is it important from a social component, but also from a safety component.
And also, I mean, I think it's, you might want to touch on the public spaces in the building that's kind of, and in the corner's pretty extraordinary. It's extending the social space of Bryant Park into the building.
So along 6th Avenue, where the most valuable retail could have gone, we decided to make sure that there was a public space. It's called the Urban Garden Room. It's highly used. People love it. People go in and they can have a meeting down there because it's such a pleasant place to be, and it reflects the spirit of Bryant Park. And you're able to go in and enjoy yourself and also get a little bit of nature inside that should be outside.
Well, I think if I understand the question, it's obviously we were thrilled to have the planning be able to yield that park, that triangle park, which is right across from 7 World Trade Center, which has become, I think, so essential to giving a sense of place to downtown. Even as the building of the World Trade Center has unfolded, 7 World Trade Center has a gracious public space that is sort of part of the building in a bigger sense. One of the challenges, though, I have to tell you, of that building was that we didn't have much space at the grade level to work with because the first 3 stories of the building, other than the lobby, are all the Con Ed substation, which are filled with these massive transformers and other gear necessary to sustain the electric power system of Lower Manhattan. So in some ways, I think it's, with the park outside, it's a model, and in some ways, I look forward to the other buildings that we're building, which have more of that, the dynamism of retail at the base, which have that interconnection both above grade through the pedestrian experience and also below grade to the rest of the area, and which face Memorial Park, which is Bryant Park times 1.5 in size, and we'll have all of those trees and all those people in that gracious public space experience that downtown really needs. So I think that it's in some ways it's still unfolding downtown.
I mean, I think it should also be said that this basic, extraordinarily important move, putting Greenwich Street through, I was over the city at the time, and Larry and Jano were extraordinarily gracious about it, set the stage for the street grid coming back and being reintroduced to the World Trade Center site, which I think in turn will make the site that much more sustainable because it makes it a true pedestrian environment and connects it to Tribeca to the north, which was talking about and so forth. So I think that just in some cases, these relatively small urban moves can have very dramatic kind of sustainability.
That can't be emphasized enough, not to go on, but I mean the one planning issue that people have not focused on at the World Trade Center, which is a huge issue, and was quietly resolved in a favorable way, was grades, the elevation.
Yeah.
There's a natural grade running from Church Street down towards the river, naturally, right? It slopes down towards the river, and the old World Trade Center was designed in that old way of a plinth, like a flat platform. In fact, the Port Authority sort of popped it up even, made that huge plaza, which was kind of a slightly empty, windswept plaza until almost the very end. And the result was, as you walked west, you had these huge walls growing up alongside you because the plaza was flat, but the grade naturally went down. And it created this, in addition to the fact that the streets didn't go through this huge separation with the surrounding community. So we fought very hard side of Memorial, but it wasn't some place up there as you walk further west like the old World Trade Center. And I think that's a huge issue that has been favorably resolved and will make it more of a exciting place.
I think communal spaces are just essential to any building. In ours, which is owner-occupied. In another speech, where I see that original building was completely gutted out. Right? So Ward Norman Foster took the innards out, but he created this great space inside. So here we were in 10, 13 different other spaces. We all came in under one. Now we have this grand green cafe, which has won all sorts of amazing awards for, if I could bring in local builders and supplies, why wouldn't I bring in local farmers and fresh fruit, vegetables, etc. Why can't we do the dish? Why are we constantly using throwaway materials? Why can't we figure out how to clean, green cleaning, etc. into the space? But there's a theater there. There's 2 art galleries. It became this great engine to drive people to talk to each other. They weren't just tweeting. They weren't just doing social media. They were sharing innovation together over a meal, having a conversation. The light was pouring in. They didn't just wipe away the old building, which Mr. Hearst started the company with. They literally and figuratively stayed foundation and then built upon. So that when you look up, you see the future of media and what you could create. So community spaces are very important. I mean, otherwise, the most sustainable thing we can do is just stay home and work on a computer, right? Which some people say is the future of work. I disagree. I think you have to create spaces so that people can talk to each other, and then that's where great ideas come from.
Any closing thoughts?
Ably and stimulating way brought out a lot of key issues that we hope you're all thinking about as you go in your design and development professions to change the way our buildings work.
Okay, I just wanted to thank the panelists very much for coming tonight and giving us their thoughts and their time. And thank you all for staying late night. It's a very important topic, so we're very glad we could join you. We're very glad to be able to do this